There is a version of the Vietnam War that most people know. It involves protest songs and jungle humidity and the image of a helicopter lifting off a rooftop. It involves a country that misunderstood a conflict it could not win, soldiers who came home broken, and a government that made mistakes it later regretted. That version is almost entirely wrong. Not because the facts are fabricated, but because the framing was designed from the beginning to make the war seem like a failure of understanding, rather than what it actually was, which was a failure of honesty. The war was not misunderstood. It was misrepresented, systematically, deliberately, at every level of command, from the forward operating base to the office of the Secretary of Defense. The soldiers who fought in it often knew this. The generals frequently knew this. The men writing the cables and composing the briefings and selecting which photographs reached the press, they knew it too. And yet the machinery continued. Not because anyone believed it would work, but because stopping it required admitting something that no institution is built to admit, which is that the entire premise had been false from the start. What follows is not a retelling of famous battles or a catalogue of political decisions. It is something closer to an accounting, a record of what was suppressed, altered, quietly buried, or simply never reported because reporting it would have required acknowledging what everyone already suspected. The Vietnam War lasted long enough and involved enough human beings in enough untenable situations that the list of things deliberately erased from the official record is not short. Some of what was erased involves specific atrocities. Some involves statistical fraud on a scale that is difficult to comprehend. Some involves the slow psychological disintegration of an army that was asked to fight a war whose objectives changed every 6 months and whose metrics of success were invented by people who had never left air-conditioned offices in Saigon. The first reality that the army tried to erase was also the most foundational, and it was this. The United States military knew, very early, that the war could not be won through conventional means and chose to continue fighting it anyway while publicly claiming progress. This was not a secret held by a handful of cynical officials. It was a broadly understood institutional reality that filtered upward and was systematically converted at each level of command into optimistic language before it reached anyone with the authority to end the war. The process had a kind of bureaucratic elegance to it. A lieutenant in the field would report that a village had been cleared and the enemy had retreated. That report would travel up to a captain who would note that the village had been pacified. The captain's report would reach a colonel who would record that the region was showing progress towards stabilization. By the time the information reached Saigon, it described a war being won. By the time it reached Washington, it described a war almost over. The distance between what a soldier experienced on the ground and what appeared in an official briefing was not a matter of interpretation. It was a matter of deliberate translation. Men who had spent weeks watching the same trails fill with enemy movement after every sweep, who had watched villages declare loyalty to Saigon in the morning and shelter North Vietnamese soldiers by nightfall, who had watched their own patrols walk into ambushes on roads they had cleared the previous month. Those men were filing reports that described something real. What happened to those reports as they moved up the chain of command is one of the least examined and most consequential processes of the entire war. The body count system is usually discussed in terms of its moral implications, and those are significant. But the more precise problem with the body count was epistemological. It created a situation in which the primary measure of success in a war was a number that could not be accurately obtained, was routinely inflated at every level of command, and bore almost no relationship to any meaningful military objective. A war being fought without a clear territorial goal, without a defined enemy formation to destroy, without an end point that could be stated in terms of geography or political control, needed some metric of progress. The body count was the answer the Pentagon settled on. Every enemy killed was progress. Progress could be quantified. Quantification could be reported. Reports could be given to Congress and the press. And so the number became the war. What this meant in practice was something that soldiers lived with every day and that almost no official document acknowledged. Units under pressure to produce high body counts began to count everything. Civilian casualties were counted. Enemy soldiers killed carrying no weapons were counted. People killed in disputed circumstances were counted. In some cases, the same body was counted more than once if it was found by more than one unit. There were documented instances of soldiers being pressured by officers to increase their counts before reports were submitted. There were units that would round up significantly. There were cases where the math simply did not work, where reported enemy casualties exceeded any plausible estimate of enemy forces in a given area by a factor of 2 or 3, and those reports were accepted and forwarded anyway, because questioning them would have required someone to explain why their sector was not performing. The army understood that the body count was unreliable. This was not a conclusion reached after the war. Internal analyses conducted during the war raised serious questions about the accuracy of reported figures. Studies commissioned within the military itself noted that kill ratios were inconsistent with known enemy force structures, that reported attrition rates would have required the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong to have lost their entire fighting force multiple times over, that the correlation between high body counts and subsequent pacification of an area was essentially zero. These studies existed. They were classified. They were not used to change policy. The body count continued because it was the only number anyone had agreed to care about, and because producing a different number would have required admitting that the current number meant nothing. The second reality that was systematically suppressed was the condition and coherence of the South Vietnamese military, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, which the entire American strategy depended upon, but which American commanders and officials spent years describing in terms that bore almost no relationship to the institution's actual capabilities. The theory of Vietnamization, which became official policy under Nixon, held that American forces would gradually transfer combat responsibility to South Vietnamese units that had been trained, equipped, and prepared to hold the country on their own. For this theory to function, those South Vietnamese units needed to be functional. The classified assessments of those units, many of which have since been declassified, described something very different. Desertion rates in ARVN units were not occasional problems to be managed. They were structural features of an institution that had profound difficulty inspiring loyalty from men who often did not believe in the cause they were fighting for, who came from regions they were then sent away from, who were poorly paid and sometimes not paid at all, and who had watched the war's management produce outcomes that made sustained confidence almost impossible. In some periods and some regions, desertion rates ran into the tens of thousands per year. American advisors embedded with ARVN units filed reports describing endemic corruption in the officer corps, incompetent leadership installed through political rather than military criteria, equipment that was maintained poorly or not at all, and a recurring pattern in which ARVN units would perform adequately when American forces were directly alongside them and deteriorate immediately when American presence was reduced. These reports were written. They exist. They were read by people in positions of authority. They were not reflected in the official public characterization of South Vietnamese military readiness, which remained persistently optimistic through most of the war, and which was used to justify both the continuation of American involvement and the pace of withdrawal. The gap between what the advisory system was reporting privately and what American officials were saying publicly about ARVN capability is not a narrow one. It is wide enough to constitute a sustained, deliberate misrepresentation of a military reality that had direct consequences for the lives of both American and South Vietnamese soldiers. The third reality involved the nature of the enemy and the degree to which American strategy was built on assumptions about that enemy that were demonstrably false and that the intelligence community knew to be false. The official framing of the war throughout most of its duration held that the insurgency in South Vietnam was primarily a product of external direction and support from North Vietnam, that the Viet Cong were essentially a proxy force controlled from Hanoi, and that degrading the North's capacity to support the insurgency would cause the insurgency to collapse. This framing supported the bombing campaigns against North Vietnam. It supported the interdiction operations against the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It supported the strategic logic of search and destroy, which aimed to attrit the enemy's externally supplied forces faster than they could be replaced. Intelligence assessments that challenged this framing existed throughout the war and were consistently marginalized. The insurgency in South Vietnam had deep indigenous roots that predated significant North Vietnamese involvement. The Viet Cong drew on genuine grievances among the South Vietnamese rural population, including land distribution issues, the brutal methods of the Diem government and its successors, and a nationalism that did not map cleanly onto the Cold War framework that American policymakers were applying. CIA analysis, State Department assessments, and reports from field personnel repeatedly noted that the insurgency's strength derived substantially from conditions within South Vietnam that bombing North Vietnam did nothing to address. These assessments reached decision-makers. They did not change the strategy. What changed was the language surrounding the strategy. When bombing campaigns did not produce the predicted collapse of enemy resolve, the explanation shifted. When pacification programs did not produce the predicted shift in rural loyalty, the metrics were adjusted. When the attrition strategy did not produce the predicted degradation of enemy capability, the timeline was extended. The strategy itself was never formally abandoned, because abandoning it would have required explaining why it had been pursued for so long. Instead, it continued in modified form, while the publicly stated rationale evolved around it, always finding some new formulation that allowed the claim of progress to be maintained. The fourth reality concerns the treatment of soldiers who reported crimes, who refused orders they believed to be unlawful, or who attempted to use internal channels to document things that were happening in the field. The Army's formal position on this has always been that such channels existed and were available. The lived reality of soldiers who attempted to use them was generally quite different. The social and institutional pressure within combat units against reporting atrocities or misconduct was enormous and largely invisible to anyone outside those units. A soldier who reported that his unit had killed civilians faced the immediate practical reality of continuing to serve alongside the men he had reported in conditions of extreme danger, where trust and cohesion were not abstract values but survival requirements. The unit cohesion that military culture prizes as a virtue was also, in this context, an effective mechanism for suppressing accountability. Beyond the unit level, the institutional processing of such reports frequently produced outcomes that either minimized the offense, reclassified the incident, or resulted in consequences so light as to communicate clearly that the reporting had been a mistake. There were cases where soldiers who reported misconduct found themselves facing administrative difficulties, reassignments, or informal ostracism. There were cases where formal investigations were initiated and then quietly dropped. There were cases where the paperwork simply did not move forward. The message received by soldiers observing these outcomes was not ambiguous. It was that the institution's interest in self-protection was greater than its interest in accountability, and that this hierarchy of interests would be enforced through whatever means were available. My Lai is the incident that became public and therefore entered the historical record. The question that has received less attention is how many incidents of similar character did not become public. The answer, based on testimony collected after the war, documents that have been declassified, and the work of journalists and historians who have spent decades reconstructing the record, is that My Lai was not an isolated event. It was the event that could not be suppressed. There was an internal Army inquiry, the Peers Commission, that examined not just the massacre itself, but the systematic failure of reporting mechanisms that had allowed it to remain hidden for more than a year. The Commission's findings on the extent of the cover-up and on the command environment that had made the massacre possible were themselves largely suppressed. The full Peers report was classified for years. Portions of it remain restricted. The fifth reality involves the Phoenix program, which was a joint CIA and military operation designed to identify and neutralize Viet Cong infrastructure through a combination of intelligence gathering, capture, and targeted killing. The program's existence was not entirely secret, but its methods and outcomes were subject to extensive official obfuscation. The Phoenix program's structure created incentives for the same kind of numerical inflation that afflicted body count reporting. Provincial reconnaissance units, the paramilitary forces that conducted many Phoenix operations, were operating in environments where distinguishing actual Viet Cong cadre from civilians with suspected sympathies was extraordinarily difficult, and where the pressure to produce numbers created conditions in which accuracy was not the primary consideration. Documented abuses within the Phoenix program included the killing of people who had not been properly vetted, the use of torture in interrogation, the settling of local personal and political scores under the program's authority, and the systematic exaggeration of the program's impact on actual Viet Cong organizational capacity. CIA officers who raised concerns about these practices found those concerns unwelcome. Congressional testimony about the program was carefully managed to present it as a precision instrument when the operational reality was considerably messier. The program's director, William Colby, later became CIA director and testified before Congress in ways that were selective enough about the program's methods that subsequent disclosures created significant credibility problems for his earlier accounts. The sixth reality concerns the air war, which killed an enormous number of people, destroyed an enormous amount of infrastructure, and produced results that the Air Force and its civilian overseers persistently claimed were greater than subsequent analysis could support. The bombing of North Vietnam was justified through a series of rationales that evolved as each preceding rationale failed to produce predicted results. The Rolling Thunder campaign, which ran for years with interruptions, was supposed to break North Vietnamese will, interdict supply lines effectively enough to degrade military capability in the South, and signal American resolve in a way that would produce negotiation. None of these objectives were achieved at the scale claimed. Internal Air Force assessments, some of which reached decision-makers and were set aside, noted that the bombing was not interdicting supplies at a rate that meaningfully affected enemy operations, that North Vietnamese air defenses were adapting, that civilian casualties were significant and were producing political costs that offset any military gains, and that enemy will showed no signs of breaking. The bombing of Cambodia and Laos was conducted under a classification framework specifically designed to hide it from Congress and the American public. The menu bombings in Cambodia, which began in 1969, were recorded in falsified documents that showed the missions as having taken place over South Vietnam. Military personnel who knew the actual targets were instructed to maintain the false record. This was not a minor administrative irregularity. It was a systematic falsification of official government documents about military operations conducted at the direction of the highest levels of the Nixon administration, involving thousands of individual missions over a period of years. When this eventually came to light, the primary institutional response was to manage the revelation, rather than to examine what it meant about the integrity of other official records from the same period. The seventh reality involves what happened to the medical and psychiatric records of soldiers who experienced what would now be diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder, but what the military during and immediately after Vietnam categorized in ways that minimized the extent of the problem and reduced the institutional obligation to address it. The military's understanding of combat stress was not primitive by the standards of the time. There was a substantial body of knowledge from World War II and Korea about the psychological consequences of sustained combat exposure. What the military chose to do with that knowledge in Vietnam was to manage it in ways that prioritized keeping soldiers in the field and minimizing the visibility of the problem. Soldiers presenting with severe psychological symptoms were frequently returned to combat after brief treatment periods. Diagnoses were often framed in terms that did not create records that would follow soldiers home and complicate their subsequent military service or benefits claims. The rate of psychiatric casualties was significantly underreported in official statistics. After the war, when veterans began presenting in large numbers at VA facilities with symptoms consistent with what was eventually codified as PTSD, the initial institutional response was resistant. The Veterans Administration was slow to acknowledge the syndrome, slow to develop treatment protocols, and for years operated under frameworks that made it difficult for veterans to establish service connections for psychological injuries that were, in many cases, direct consequences of what they had experienced. The eighth reality involves the drug epidemic within the military during the Vietnam era, which was acknowledged publicly in a limited way, but whose full dimensions were suppressed for years. By the early 1970s, heroin use among American soldiers in Vietnam had reached levels that represented a genuine military readiness problem. The availability of high-purity heroin in Vietnam, its low cost, the psychological environment that made its use attractive, and the relative ease of obtaining it combined to produce a situation that the Army was simultaneously aware of, officially minimizing, and largely unable to address through the mechanisms it tried. Internal assessments of drug use were more alarming than public statements from military or civilian officials. There were units where a significant fraction of enlisted men were using heroin regularly. There were cases of soldiers being deployed in states of addiction. There were cases where officers knew about drug use in their units and chose not to address it because addressing it would have meant losing personnel they could not replace and generating paperwork that would reflect poorly on their command. The military's approach to drug use oscillated between punitive responses that drove the problem underground and treatment initiatives that were underfunded and structurally inadequate. What it did not do, in any systematic way, was acknowledge the problem's scale honestly in public documents or official statements. The ninth reality involves the racial dynamics within the military in Vietnam, which produced a level of internal tension and conflict that was extensively documented in internal military reports and almost entirely absent from official public communications about the war. The Vietnam era coincided with the civil rights movement and its aftermath, and the military was not insulated from the social changes occurring in American society. African American soldiers in Vietnam served in a context where the contradictions of fighting for a country that had not yet delivered equality were acutely felt. Casualty rates among African Americans in the early years of the war were disproportionately high, a fact that generated significant criticism and that the military eventually addressed through changes in assignment policy. But the racial tension within the military went beyond casualty statistics. There were documented incidents of racial violence between soldiers in rear areas. There were cases of African American soldiers forming their own informal organizations that operated in parallel to, and sometimes in conflict with, the formal military structure. There were courts-martial that many participants and observers believed were racially biased in ways that produced disparate outcomes for black soldiers facing disciplinary proceedings. Internal Army studies conducted during this period acknowledged the severity of the racial climate within the military and made recommendations that were implemented partially and slowly. The public face of the military during this period continued to present integration as a success story, while internal documents described an institution struggling with conflicts it did not have adequate frameworks to address. The 10th reality concerns what was known as fragging, which was the killing or attempted killing of officers and non-commissioned officers by their own troops, usually with fragmentation grenades. This phenomenon existed in previous wars, but its incidence in Vietnam reached levels that represented something new in the history of the American military. The number of documented fragging incidents ran into the hundreds. The number of suspected fragging incidents that were recorded as accidents or that went uninvestigated was certainly higher. The phenomenon reflected a breakdown in the relationship between leadership and troops that the military spent years trying to minimize the significance of in its public statements. Fragging occurred in a context where many enlisted soldiers believed that the war had no achievable purpose, that the objectives being given to them were meaningless, that the officers leading them were sometimes incompetent or reckless or indifferent to their survival, and that the institution above them had no real concern for their welfare beyond what was necessary to keep them functional as military assets. The men who committed fragging incidents were not, in most cases, violent criminals who had been poorly screened for military service. They were soldiers who had reached a specific kind of breaking point in a specific institutional environment. The military's response to fragging as a phenomenon was primarily oriented toward detection and punishment, rather than toward understanding what conditions had produced it, because understanding those conditions honestly would have required a different kind of accounting than the institution was prepared to do. The 11th reality involves the official characterization of the Tet Offensive and its aftermath. Tet is usually described as a military defeat for the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong that was nevertheless a psychological turning point that undermined American public support for the war. This framing contains enough truth to function as a narrative, but distorts the full picture in important ways. The Tet Offensive was a significant military defeat for the attacking forces in the sense that they sustained enormous casualties and failed to hold any of the cities and installations they targeted. But the fact that the offensive could occur on that scale, simultaneously across that many locations, including the grounds of the American Embassy in Saigon, represented a failure of American and South Vietnamese intelligence and military preparedness that the official record worked hard to obscure. In the months before Tet, intelligence reports had indicated that a major offensive was being prepared. The scale and coordination of what occurred in late January and early February of 1968 surprised American commanders in ways that should have prompted serious questions about the accuracy of previous optimistic assessments. General Westmoreland had been publicly claiming, shortly before Tet, that the war had reached a point where the end was coming into view. The offensive did not simply create a psychological shift in American public opinion. It exposed the gap between what had been claimed publicly about the state of the war and what the situation on the ground actually was. The subsequent effort to characterize Tet primarily as a media failure, as a military victory that was miscommunicated to a credulous public, served to redirect attention from the question of how official assessments had been so wrong for so long. The 12th reality involves the conduct of pacification programs and what happened when those programs produced evidence that contradicted official theories about winning hearts and minds. The pacification effort, which aimed to establish secure control over the South Vietnamese countryside and build genuine loyalty to the Saigon government, was approached with various methodologies over the course of the war, most of which shared the characteristic of measuring outputs rather than outcomes. The number of villages classified as secure, the number of hamlets that had achieved certain rating levels in the hamlet evaluation system, the number of local officials who had been installed, and the number of development projects that had been initiated, all of these could be counted and reported. Whether any of it was producing a population that genuinely supported the Saigon government was a harder question, and one that the metrics were not designed to answer honestly. The Hamlet evaluation system in particular was a quantification exercise that generated regular reports showing steady progress toward pacification goals. Internal critiques of the system, produced by analysts who examined its methodology, noted that the ratings were substantially influenced by political pressure, that evaluators understood which way their reports needed to move to satisfy their superiors, and that the relationship between a hamlet's rating and its actual security situation was unreliable. The system continued to be used, and its outputs continued to be cited in official assessments of pacification progress, because the alternative was to admit that no one had a reliable way of knowing whether pacification was working. The 13th reality involves the systematic destruction of evidence related to civilian casualties and human rights abuses, which occurred at multiple levels and through multiple mechanisms. Some of this destruction was deliberate. Some was accomplished through classification frameworks that made documents effectively inaccessible. Some occurred through the simple institutional fact that records of events that were embarrassing to the military were not carefully preserved, while records of successful operations were meticulously maintained. The result is an evidentiary record of the war that is structurally skewed toward official narratives and away from the experiences of people who were on the wrong end of American military operations. Free fire zones, which were areas designated as areas in which anyone present could be treated as an enemy combatant, produced civilian casualties on a scale that was poorly documented and remains difficult to assess with precision. The logic of the free fire zone was that the population had been warned to leave, and that therefore anyone remaining was either an enemy or had chosen to shelter enemies. The operational reality was that warning systems were imperfect, that many civilians could not leave for reasons that had nothing to do with their political loyalties, that the designation of an area as a free fire zone was not always accurately communicated to the civilians in it, and that the practical application of the free fire concept by units operating under fire and under pressure was not always precise. Investigations into specific incidents of civilian casualties in free fire zones were rare, and records of such investigations as were conducted were often classified at levels that effectively prevented review. The 14th reality involves the experience of prisoners of war and the political uses to which their situation was put. The treatment of American prisoners in North Vietnamese captivity was genuinely brutal in many cases, and the suffering of those prisoners is not a matter of dispute. But the official handling of POW and MIA issues during and after the war involved a level of political manipulation that was not fully acknowledged. The Nixon administration's use of the POW issue as a reason to maintain American involvement in the war, even as the strategic rationale for that involvement had effectively dissolved, exploited genuine public concern about American prisoners in ways that serve political rather than humanitarian goals. The families of POWs and MIAs were given information and assurances that were sometimes inconsistent with what the government actually knew. After the war, the handling of the MIA issue became a separate and extensive chapter in the history of official misrepresentation. Congressional investigations conducted in the 1980s and 90s examined evidence regarding the fate of Americans listed as missing and the degree to which the government had been forthcoming with families about what it knew. The Senate Select Committee on POW and MIA Affairs, which conducted an extensive investigation in the early 1990s, produced findings that documented significant failures in information management and raised serious questions about the completeness of disclosures made to families over the preceding 2 decades. The 15th reality involves the experience of Vietnamese civilians across both North and South Vietnam, whose suffering was systematically rendered invisible in the official American account of the war. The strategic framing of the conflict as a defense of South Vietnamese freedom created a rhetorical requirement that the South Vietnamese appear as beneficiaries of American intervention rather than as people caught in the consequences of it. The reality of civilian life in South Vietnam during the war, particularly in rural areas subject to repeated sweeps, bombing, forced relocation, and the presence of multiple armed actors demanding compliance and punishing any appearance of loyalty to the opposing side, was something that official communications had very little mechanism for representing honestly. The forced relocation of rural populations into strategic hamlets and later into refugee camps created an urbanization of South Vietnam that was not the product of economic development, but of displacement. By certain periods of the war, a significant fraction of the South Vietnamese rural population had been moved, willingly or not, from the villages and land their families had occupied for generations into settlements that provided neither security nor the social and economic structures that had given their previous existence meaning. This process was described in official communications as a security measure and a development initiative. The experience of the people subjected to it was something else entirely, and accounts of that experience were not features of the briefings given to Congress or the statements given to the press. The bombing campaigns, particularly in North Vietnam and along the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos and Cambodia, produced civilian casualties that were acknowledged in classified assessments and minimized or denied in public statements. The bombing of Laos, which was not publicly acknowledged for years, produced one of the highest concentrations of unexploded ordnance of any country in history. Cluster munitions dropped during the war continue to kill and maim Laotian civilians decades later. This ongoing consequence was not part of the war's official accounting during the period when it was being conducted, and the acknowledgement of American responsibility for it has been partial and slow. The 16th reality involves the late war disintegration of military discipline and unit cohesion, which reached levels in certain periods and certain theaters that the military found extremely difficult to acknowledge because doing so would have required confronting the institutional consequences of asking men to fight a war whose purpose had become impossible to articulate. The term used for the most severe manifestation of this was combat refusal, and it occurred with a frequency that was suppressed in official reporting. Units or elements of units that declined to carry out orders to advance, to conduct patrols, or to engage in operations they believed to be tactically pointless and personally catastrophic, were sometimes handled through negotiation rather than through formal disciplinary proceedings, because formal proceedings would have generated records and because commanding officers had their own assessment of the rationality of the orders being refused. The broader phenomenon of what soldiers called search and avoid, meaning the practice of conducting patrols in ways that minimized contact with the enemy while filing reports suggesting aggressive engagement, was widespread enough to be openly discussed within units while remaining almost entirely absent from official records. Officers sometimes knew about and tacitly accepted search and avoid because the alternative was to insist on operations that would produce casualties without achieving anything that could be described as a military objective. The metrics that were being reported up the chain of command continued to show patrols conducted, kilometers covered, and operations executed, while the operational reality those metrics were supposed to represent had become something else entirely. The 17th reality involves the management of information in the period immediately after the war's end, when the military and civilian institutions that had managed its conduct faced the question of how to assess what had happened. The immediate post-war period produced a significant body of institutional analysis, much of it classified, that examined the failures of doctrine, intelligence, command culture, and strategic thinking that had characterized the American effort. Some of this analysis was valuable and honest and influenced subsequent military doctrine in important ways. But alongside the genuine self-examination was a parallel institutional project of constructing a narrative that distributed blame in ways that protected the most powerful actors and shifted responsibility toward those who were less able to defend themselves. The political leadership, military leadership, and intelligence community each produced accounts and supported narratives that emphasized factors outside their control. The constraints imposed by the political requirement to avoid nuclear escalation, the failure of South Vietnamese political institutions, the home front opposition that had undermined military effectiveness, the media coverage that had misrepresented military successes. Each of these factors was real. Each was also convenient. The degree to which they were emphasized in official and semi-official post-war accounts was not proportional to their actual causal significance. It was proportional to their usefulness in explaining an outcome without requiring acknowledgement of institutional failures at the highest levels. The 18th reality is perhaps the quietest, and in some ways the most encompassing. It involves the gap between the war's official purpose, which was consistently stated in terms of defending South Vietnamese freedom and containing communist expansion, and the actual considerations that drove decisions about the war's conduct and duration. This gap was not confined to a single decision or a single administration. It persisted across multiple presidencies and was documented in the internal communications of each of them. The Pentagon Papers, which Daniel Ellsberg released in 1971, provided the first systematic public glimpse of this gap. The documents showed that decision-makers across multiple administrations had privately assessed the prospects for military success in terms that were starkly different from their public statements. They showed that the stated objectives of the war had frequently been secondary to other considerations, including domestic political calculations, alliance credibility concerns, and the simple institutional momentum of a massive military commitment that was easier to continue than to end. They showed that the war was being fought at various points, primarily to avoid the political consequences of losing it, which is a different thing from fighting it to achieve the objectives in whose name it had been started. The Nixon administration's response to the Pentagon Papers was to pursue criminal prosecution of Ellsberg and to seek to suppress the documents through an injunction against the newspapers publishing them. The Supreme Court ruled against the injunction. The criminal case against Ellsberg collapsed when it emerged that the administration had engaged in illegal activities in its effort to discredit him. The documents themselves remained in the record and continued to shape historical understanding of the war's internal management. But the administrative effort to suppress them was its own kind of evidence about the relationship between the war's managers and the truth of what they had been doing. The war ended in April of 1975, when North Vietnamese forces entered Saigon and the government of the Republic of Vietnam ceased to exist. The American military involvement had ended in 1973 with the Paris Peace Accords, which the Nixon administration presented publicly as peace with honor and which produced a ceasefire that neither side observed in ways that would have made the phrase meaningful. The Accords effectively formalized a situation in which American forces withdrew while the political and military contest continued. When that contest ended 2 years later with the fall of Saigon, it ended in the way that many of the people who had managed the American war effort had privately acknowledged in classified communications and internal memoranda that would not become public for years, that it was likely to end. The evacuation from the roof of the CIA station in Saigon, which is one of the images most associated with the war's end, occurred 2 years after the formal American military withdrawal. In the interval, the United States had continued to provide military assistance to South Vietnam, had made various commitments about the nature of that assistance that were not fully kept, and had watched the situation develop along lines that the internal assessments had long suggested were probable. The last American combat personnel left. The people who had worked with the American presence, who had built their lives and in some cases their survival around the continuation of American involvement, did not all leave with them. The war in Vietnam cost somewhere between 1.5 and 3 million Vietnamese lives, depending on the methodology used to estimate civilian casualties, which themselves were never reliably counted. It cost the lives of approximately 58,000 Americans. It cost the lives of significant but inadequately documented numbers of Laotian and Cambodian civilians. It produced a generation of American veterans, many of whom came home to inadequate care, inadequate recognition, and a country that preferred not to examine too closely what had been done in its name, and what had been done to the men it had sent to do it. The institutions that managed the war continued after the war ended. The officials who had presided over its conduct mostly continued in public life. The documents that described the gap between what was said publicly and what was known privately were declassified gradually over subsequent decades, producing periodic revisions in the historical understanding of specific decisions and periods. The systematic character of the misrepresentation, the degree to which the falsification of information was not a series of individual failures, but a sustained institutional practice supported at the highest levels, and enforced through the normal mechanisms of bureaucratic pressure and career incentive, that aspect of the record has been slower to become part of the dominant understanding of what happened. The war did not end because its purposes had been achieved. It did not end because a strategic objective had been reached or a political settlement had been secured that corresponded to the goals in whose name it had been fought. It ended because the situation it had been trying to prevent came to pass anyway. 2 years after the last American forces left, and the institutions and the government and the country moved on, the men who had filed false reports and accepted false reports and written official assessments they knew to be incorrect and given congressional testimony that selected carefully from what they knew, they moved on too. Some of them wrote memoirs. Some of them gave interviews. Some of them expressed regret in terms that were careful not to specify precisely what they regretted or why. The last American combat soldier to die in Vietnam died before the war officially ended. The last Vietnamese civilians to die from unexploded American ordnance died after it. There is no precise date for when that second category concluded, because it has not concluded. The munitions are still there. The ground still holds them. And in that specific material sense, the war that was misrepresented at every level for more than a decade, that consumed resources and lives and institutional credibility on a scale that reshaped American politics and American military culture, continues in the soil of a country that most of the people who managed it never visited.